Hello and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin and I'm all on my lonesome this episode. My good friend and collaborator Mike Whitehouse has his plate kind of full at the moment, so we've not been able to schedule a joint recording, but I thought you guys had waited long enough for a new episode. Hopefully we'll be back to our usual double act soon. Before I crack on, I'd like to say hello to our newest Patreon subscribers. At the Nightbird level, we're joined by Jenny RB. Great to have you on board, Jenny. And glittering high in the dark sky, our new Dawn stars, Gail and Rebecca Bradley. Gail and Rebecca, thank you so much. You guys are awesome. If you'd like to support the show, you can of course do so at patreon.com/talkingtilldawn. So, I thought we hadn't really done a straight true crime episode for a while. We like to space them out a little bit with more fanciful mysteries because, you know, this kind of thing can get a bit heavy if you focus too much on it, but some of our most popular episodes have been on the true crime side of things, Bible John, Pedro Alonso Lopez, so you guys definitely seem to have an appetite for it. Tonight I'm going to be digging into a harrowing case that was huge when it happened but has mostly been forgotten today. I had a look, actually, and out of the absolute mountain of true crime podcasts that exist out there these days, I couldn't find a single one covering this topic. Yep, we are on uncharted territory here, listeners. So it's taken me a little longer than usual to research this. I've had to do it almost entirely from primary sources, archived newspapers and such, but here we are. I hope you find it interesting. I will warn you, however, this case does involve discussion of murder, suicide, and sexual exploitation, which will not be suitable for all listeners. If any of those issues are likely to cause you more distress than it's worth, then you know what to do. Feel free to skip this episode and we'll catch you next time. There is a film you will never see. It was most likely produced in 1984 and featured a 25-year-old model named Tina Atter in the lead role, playing opposite 48-year-old amateur filmmaker Geoffrey Graham Jones, who also served as the film's director and screenwriter. The plot, such as it was, centred on a young woman who is emotionally neglected by her much older husband. At the film's finale, the man elopes with another woman, and the wife is found dead, hanging from a noose, with the audience left to speculate as to whether she took her own life or met with foul play at the hands of the husband. The ambiguity is, in some ways, eerily prescient of what was to come. Jones screened the short film, entitled Enough Rope, at an ersatz premiere in his own home in Hall Green, a genteel suburb of Birmingham. Tina, his star, attended the premiere, along with a few of her friends and family and some members of a local amateur filmmaking club of which Jones was a member. He even hired an usherette to sell ice cream to his guests. Jones was very happy indeed with the film. He had taken great care in its production, particularly in getting the details of the hanging scene just right. And he had clearly relished sharing his work with an audience. In spite of his seeming pride in the film, or perhaps because of it, or indeed perhaps for another reason entirely, a short time later in April 1985, Jones decided to remake Enough Rope with a different lead actress. But this time, the production would lead to a terrible tragedy and a crime that inspired lurid headlines and disturbing speculation in its time, but has become almost entirely forgotten today. Marion Terry was a 17-year-old school leaver who was struggling to find work. Marion had left school in 1984 to enrol in a beauty therapy program at a local further education college, but hadn't found it to her liking. After 4 months, she had withdrawn from the course. According to her mother, she had hoped to find a placement as a hairdressing apprentice, something a wee bit more on the job than a college course maybe, but instead, on Friday the 18th of April 1985, she found an advertisement in the window of a local newsagent's that read, "Regal gowns, film and fashion require young lady for part-time modelling. Experience not necessary. Apply Mr. G. Jones, Egginton Road, Hall Green," and a phone number. According to her mother, Marion had never shown any particular interest in a modelling career, but her attention was immediately drawn by this ad. Marion returned home and immediately rang the number. Her father, Stanley Terry, witnessed the call, and neither of them noted anything untoward in the conversation with Mr. Jones. He seemed polite, well-spoken, professional. He didn't seem excessively eager to get Marion into the studio either, which might have raised alarm bells if he'd had. Instead, he had the careful and selective manner of a man genuinely trying to find the right applicant for a job, even mentioning a previous candidate who'd been unsuccessful because she hadn't followed his request that she come wearing a smart outfit and black skirt. That in itself subtly goes against any general suspicions they might have had. The stereotypical camera creep, at least as far as ordinary people might imagine, isn't telling young women to show up in business dress. It's a low-cut top or a bikini, or they don't care what you're wearing because they're going to try and get you out of it. Obviously that's not always true, but you know. So Geoffrey Jones tells her he's willing to give her an interview if she's able to get to his place within the next half hour. In a later statement published in the Birmingham Evening Mail, Marion's father, Stanley Terry, said, "I would have taken Marion in her car, but I had to wait in for the gas fitter, so I agreed she could go alone." Tragically, it was a decision that, I can only imagine, must have weighed heavily upon Mr. Terry for the rest of his life. Marion left for Egginton Road on foot, wearing a black pencil skirt as Jones had requested. Her home was only about a 15-minute walk from his, and witnesses saw her arriving there about 3 p.m. She was next seen just before 9 p.m. by the paramedics, who found her dangling beneath a loft hatch in Jones's home from a hangman's noose tied over a banister in the attic. The bubbly, vivacious teenager had had her life cut brutally short. Near the body was an overturned piano stool and a Super 8 camera. Margaret Pugh had first met Geoffrey Jones in the late 1970s. The pair had met through what was then known as a friendship agency, a sort of Bumble of its day. At that time, Margaret was, on paper at least, not a single woman. Jones was a 42-year-old bachelor living with his mother. She was in her early 30s, trapped in a broken marriage and looking for the exit. In one newspaper report, she's quoted as saying, "I had a very unhappy marriage and have needed treatment for my nerves after that." Treatment for one's nerves is, for anyone who doesn't know, an older British euphemism for counselling or psychiatric treatment. So, although it's not completely spelled out here, we can infer that perhaps this previous marriage was violent or controlling or otherwise traumatic. Her association with Jones, by contrast, appears to have been quite respectful and agreeable, and she even credits him with saving her from her previous situation. After meeting him, she divorced her previous husband, and then she and Jones became an item. Quote, "He was a refined man who liked visiting museums and art galleries. We had a lot in common." Of course, it was not exclusively smooth sailing for the couple. It seems Jones's mother, a figure who looms large throughout his story, disapproved of her son consorting with a divorcee and put pressure on him to stop seeing Margaret. And in fact, he seems to have obeyed his mother in this regard, and the pair do seem to have drifted apart for a time. But in April of 1981, Jones's mother passed away, and the couple began to see each other again and subsequently got engaged. As far as Margaret Pugh was concerned, Geoffrey had never shown any signs of threatening behaviour or sexual deviance. On the contrary, he exhibited very little interest in sex at all, to the point of never actually consummating their 7-year relationship, though Margaret didn't necessarily consider that a big issue. Otherwise, quote, "He was a perfectly normal man, a bit on the bossy side, but nothing worse." And then, on the evening of the 18th of April 1985, Margaret returned home from walking the dog to find her mother on the phone to a frantic Geoffrey Jones. She took the phone from her mother, put the receiver to her ear, and everything she thought she knew about her fiancé was turned on its head. Quote, "He said there is a dead girl in the house. He was crying. He said the girl had answered an advert and had come round to do a stunt in a film, and he had killed her. He was mumbling that he had taken 100 aspirins. He kept saying he deserved to die for what had happened." It was Margaret's subsequent call to the emergency services that summoned the police and ambulance crews who would discover Marion's body hanging from the loft, and a barely coherent Geoffrey Jones having taken a large dose of painkillers. He was taken for medical treatment and had his stomach pumped before being formally charged with murder. When interviewed by Detective Chief Inspector Barry Mackay, Geoffrey maintained that Marion's death had been a tragic accident, that while filming shots for the simulated hanging scene intended for the climax of the film, with Marion Terry standing on a piano stool with a noose around her neck, she'd asked him to go downstairs to collect her handbag and bring it to her. When he'd returned, so Jones claimed, he'd found that Marion had come off the stool, the noose had tightened round her neck, and she'd begun to asphyxiate. His attempts, or claimed attempts, to loosen the ligature around her neck and bring her down had failed due to the girl's frenzied struggling, and the incident had ended in tragedy. The detectives were of a different opinion. It appeared to them that Jones had instructed Marion to climb up on the stool and place the noose around her neck, before deliberately kicking the stool from beneath her. Jones then, per the prosecution's version of events, stood by watching and possibly filming poor Marion Terry's death throes. Judging from the press coverage and the statements made later by lawyers working for the prosecution, it seems that almost immediately, detectives were looking at this disturbing series of events as a potential example of the production, or the attempted production, of a snuff film. I should probably clarify what I mean by the term snuff film, and it's not as simple as you might think. I'm going to have to make a wee detour here to discuss the background of the term and its origins in America in the 70s, and touch a little bit on what is and isn't a snuff film, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The term was coined, or first recorded in print anyway, in Ed Sanders' The Family, the Story of Charles Manson's Dune Buggy Attack Battalion, in which one former member of the Manson family is interviewed by Sanders and claims to have seen a video of a dead body being decapitated on a beach, this being footage ostensibly filmed or obtained by other members of the Manson cult. The family member is interviewed anonymously. The story itself is hazy and somewhat dubious, and strictly speaking, what he or she describes wouldn't be called a snuff movie by most measures today. But it does seem to be where the term comes from, or at least where it entered mainstream vocabulary. Later in the 1970s, in the years following Sanders' book, the term became inextricably linked with rumours of an underground industry wherein people would purportedly be tortured and murdered on camera to create a sort of sadistic pornography, which was then supposed to be screened in seedy, smoke-filled backroom cinemas for thousands of dollars a ticket, or sold as high-priced collector's items for wealthy perverts to gloat over in their penthouses. That commercial element became an integral part of what the term snuff then represented. In other words, it's not just a depiction of a real death or a real murder. The definition that coalesced hinged on the fact that human lives were being ended, that murder was being carried out specifically to create a product, specifically for commercial gain. This was about business, about an illegal industry profiting directly from murder. That was what seemed to take the severity of it almost beyond that of murder alone, the sort of unholy union of sadism, cold-hearted profiteering, and the reduction of human suffering and death to a tradable commodity. Now, this was an era sometimes referred to as the golden age of pornography. Adult theatres were popping up everywhere, especially in the US in places like Times Square, 42nd Street. Adult films achieved a degree of mainstream success and acceptance in certain circles. On the other hand, with the rising popularity and acceptance of pornography came a reinvigorated backlash against it. The anti-porn movement maintained that the pornography industry, which was in those days still financed in no small part by organised crime, was violently abusing and exploiting the performers, particularly the women. And this abuse, supposedly, they claimed, went all the way up to performers allegedly being killed on camera in so-called snuff films. Sometimes the narrative was that this was one of the risks that new entrants into the industry faced, that snuff filmmakers would try and dupe new would-be models or adult performers into attending a shoot at a remote location where they'd be killed, or sometimes the narrative was this is what happens when an experienced performer becomes uncooperative or becomes too old and no longer marketable. You know, they were pushing the idea that the porn producers were using up their investment, the idea that the industry treats people like a commodity and when you're no longer useful, you're disposed of. Or of course, sometimes the story was that the victims were trafficked women or they were just kidnapping people off the street for it. It's easy to look back and turn our noses up at the moral crusaders spinning elaborate conspiracy theories. Personally, in general, I'm quite live and let live, assuming, of course, it's all consenting adults and no one is seriously hurt. I'm not going to lose any sleep over what people watch on their own time, but unfortunately, on some levels, the critics of the 70s porn industry had a point. It absolutely wasn't all consenting adults and no one hurt in that time. The 70s adult film industry, or at least large parts of it, were a moral cesspit. Of course, obviously not everyone that worked in the business was a bad person or had a bad time, but a not inconsequential segment of the women in the adult industry were bullied, threatened and abused. I mean, look at what came out about Linda Lovelace. I'm not going to get into all that now, but there's loads about it out there. You can look it up. Her life around the time the film Deep Throat was made was allegedly, essentially, that of a trafficking victim. The Gambino crime family and others were involved in making films. A good number of films featured actresses who turned out to be underage because no age checks had been done or producers deliberately had them lie about their ages. And in fact, in a lot of countries, actual child abuse material was commercially produced and distributed on a large scale, in some cases legally distributed because specific laws against that material had not been enacted yet in many jurisdictions. So it was much less cut and dried than we might think, and actually the fact that there were groups exerting pressure and shining a light on the dark side of the industry probably wasn't a bad thing. One area though in which it does seem these crusaders were off the mark, in which they did allow hysteria to take the reins, was on this issue of snuff films. The idea of the commercialisation of murder for entertainment became a very prominent, sometimes central piece of the narrative spun by the anti-porn lobby, and it just seems to have been just an urban legend. Certainly at that time, through the latter part of the 20th century, there doesn't seem to have ever been a verified, commercially produced and distributed snuff film discovered by law enforcement. Lots of fake ones, but no real ones. Now yes, I know the issue is muddied in the internet era, but that's another topic. We don't have time to get bogged down in that just at the moment. We're already on enough of a tangent here. But the idea of snuff being a commercially made product, that it's the financial commodification of murder, is really one of the key features that define the whole idea of snuff. In the Channel 4 documentary Does Snuff Exist?, Kenneth V. Lanning, formerly of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioural Science Unit, explains as follows. The key elements: number one, it has to be a visual depiction. On this visual image, someone was alive at the beginning and then dead at the end. The motivation for the murder is because the script requires it. This visual image is being put together for the sexual gratification of viewers, and then the final element is that this visual depiction is commercially distributed. So something like a jihadist beheading video or a cartel execution, disturbing as they may be, do not meet the FBI's definition of snuff because, first of all, the main motivation for the killing in those cases is terrorism, revenge, or propaganda, not to create a commercial product. And there's very often no sexual intent there either. The term snuff is probably fine as a casual description in those cases. However, we are referring here to a much more restrictive and elusive definition of snuff. Even recordings of killings made by murderers in the wild, which then might become available online. To use some later examples, the Dnipropetrovsk maniacs case and the case of the killing of Jun Lin in Canada in 2012. They are not true snuff films within this definition. Jun Lin's murder probably comes closest in that there is a good chance the man convicted of killing him did so primarily to create the footage, and we know he intended to distribute the footage. So there's a strong sense that he wouldn't have killed anyone if not to produce a shocking video. So you could say that it almost meets the killed because the script requires it test. But it still falls short of the commercial intent test. No one was paying him. He wasn't doing it to make money, at least directly. So the film wasn't a commercial product. If anything, he did it because he fancied the notoriety. It was all about his ego. However, If Geoffrey Jones did film the hanging of Marion Terry, as it was suspected he had, if the film was made with sexual gratification in mind, and unfortunately there are a few reasons to think it was, which we'll come to, and critically, if the footage was shot for and passed on to some seedy underground network or a paying client, then the film Geoffrey Jones made that day would indeed tick the boxes to be classified as a true snuff film. As former Special Agent Ken Lanning says, "I think that in a sense, snuff is like the Holy Grail, much talked about, long sought after, but never found." His Holy Grail analogy is a bit unfortunate, the whole positive connotations of that, but if an FBI agent is saying it's this elusive, illusory thing that's never actually been categorically proven to exist, it almost seems far-fetched that it would finally come to light in this boring, middle-class British suburb. And yet, if you read the news reports from the time, that's exactly what detectives feared they'd uncovered here. And a lot of emphasis was given to the fact that the film itself was not found at the property with the body and other evidence. It was not found at all. In fact, witnesses reported seeing Geoffrey Jones leave the property and subsequently return between the time when Marion Terry is known to have been killed and the arrival of police and paramedics who discovered her body. That's a gap of more than 5 hours. Where was he during that time? What was he doing? Who, if anyone, was he with? Did he take the film with him? To destroy it maybe? To hide it until the heat has died down? Or perhaps to deliver it to a buyer? Brian Escott Cox, QC for the prosecution during the subsequent trial, said much later in 2006, "I have a theory of my own that because he was so deeply into all these perversions, he may have been in contact with some sort of network of people who were interested in snuff movies. So in other words, the film may have been made not merely for his own bizarre gratification, but actually for the purpose of making money out of it." That, of course, is quite an extraordinary statement and one that warrants a deeper look at Geoffrey Jones's background. Jones was unemployed at the time of Marion Terry's death and seems to have gone through quite an eclectic range of day jobs in the years leading up to this, from insurance salesman, cinema projectionist, factory engineer, railway worker, which I think paints a picture of a somewhat bright mind, albeit one that didn't seem to really stick at anything. He never seems to have stayed the course and climbed the ladder or developed his career anywhere. Acquaintances described an isolated, somewhat anachronistic man. One lady, a costumer he employed to make the satin dresses the actresses would always wear in his films, described him as habitually wearing, quote, "a light blue chauffeur-style outfit which included a peaked cap, riding breeches, and black leather jackboots." He was a man of strange interests and of uncomfortable contradictions, or at least that's how it's presented in the press at the time of his trial. The fact that colleagues had stated he often made comments amounting to overt misogyny, sometimes even giving glimpses of a sexual hatred of women, that on the surface contrasts with the experiences of his fiancée Margaret and some of the women who had previously modelled and acted for him, who all described him as polite and assiduously chivalrous, always holding doors open for them, taking off his hat for the ladies and so forth. But looking a bit deeper here, I can't help but see maybe less of a contradiction and more of a type of character that we're perhaps a bit more familiar with today than in the 80s. The kind of self-described nice guy who makes a show of respecting women, but just beneath the surface completely resents and despises them for not all instantly adoring him. The sort of person who today you might find in certain parts of the incel community, for example. Over-exaggeratedly well-mannered to women, sometimes to the point of being patronising, while also calling them whores and bitches behind their back. You know, it's almost a worn-out joke at this point. The image that's forming of Geoffrey Jones here kind of embodies that cliche for me, albeit that this was about 20 years before that became a meme. You know, although he seems in some ways like a man from a previous time, he also seems like something from the age of shady online communities, something from ahead of his time in a way. He lives this fetishized life, as we'll see, with a very narrow, specific set of obsessions and prejudices and attitudes, and the whole shape of that taken together. If he did all this today, I think we'd assume he was a product of the dark side of the internet. Someone who'd spent way too much time online and not enough time playing outside in the sunshine, and had just kind of lost touch with normie reality, yet he far predates most of that. To come back to the point about the dressmaker and some of his more fetishistic aspects, it seems like he was absolutely, utterly obsessed isn't even the word. He had a complete mania for black satin. Dresses, skirts, underwear. It was the one thing without which he was completely unable to perform sexually. In a highly Freudian wrinkle to this, Jones himself attributed his fixation to his own mother's love for the material, which itself seems to have been something beyond a simple matter of taste. Apparently, she had even been married in black satin. After his arrest, as he's being interviewed by detectives, Jones, and if it wasn't such a serious and horrible case, it would almost be comical, he openly lamented that this fabric had completely dominated and ruined his life. Look, I shouldn't laugh. It's a horrible case, but black satin ruined my life. What a catchphrase. Jones seems to have had a very close relationship with his mum. When she passed away, Geoffrey sunk into a deep depression, and it was around this time that he submitted his resignation to his last known employer, Lucas Cookson Cylon Limited of Solihull, a manufacturer of hardened industrial ceramics. At Lucas Cookson, he did seem to make one or two kinda sorta friends who we'll be coming back to, but even they characterised him as a loner. Over time, he did come out of his shell and warm up a little bit, and the more unhealthy parts of his attitude seemed to get sanded down slightly by the process of social contact. However, on his mother's death, he withdrew again by asking to be made redundant. It looks to me like maybe he inherited some money and likely the house itself, which then allowed him to give up work and withdraw into the smaller world of his own interests and obsessions and demons. He did appear to seek therapy at this point, but sadly, he doesn't maybe seem to have engaged particularly well with it. Phil Banner of the Birmingham Evening Mail, in a news piece dated 24th of April 1986, wrote of Jones's time following his voluntary redundancy. Jones lived alone and spent hours watching old movies on TV featuring glamorous Hollywood stars of the 50s, like Marilyn Monroe. Ginger-haired Jones, who once worked as a cinema projectionist, logged his reactions in a diary. If he thought the female star had put in a sexy performance, he wrote, "Wow." Next to his personal rating was, "Wow, wow." And the top glamour girls earned a "Wow, double wow." "It's all pretty childish," said Detective Inspector Barry Mackay, who led the inquiry. But it was all part of his fascination for women wearing slinky black dresses, black stockings with seams, pencil skirts, and pillbox hats with veils. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with people having harmless peccadillos like that. I'm not saying Jones should be ridiculed for fancying women in black dresses or whatever. That's probably one of the least troubling things about him, believe me. But what I think this maybe speaks to is that completely immersing yourself in a very narrow range of interests doesn't even have to be sexual interests, but it's probably more acute when it is, usually isn't the healthiest thing. I think, and this is just my opinion, but I think people need more in their lives than just chasing their own personal dopamine hits. It's fine to have an interest, it's fine to pursue that interest if it's not hurting anyone, but like, it shouldn't be the only thing about you. If it dominates your thoughts, if it weighs upon your other relationships, if it worms its way into unrelated activities, that's a warning sign, I think. Most people in that situation don't go on to kill, of course, but nevertheless, I think the human mind needs a varied diet. I mean, sure, okay, Jones had a girlfriend, but one he couldn't have sex with because she wouldn't wear black satin, or he didn't want to ask her to, I guess. He had a couple of on-off friends who he creeped out with constant talk about his fantasies of women in satin being threatened in various ways. He watched TV to fill out a logbook of actresses in vintage fashion. He joined a filmmaking club and started making his own short films. He tried to start a dress hire business and a videography company, and all of those were, or morphed into, just more outlets for his obsessions. There was nothing almost in his life that was independent of his sexual interests. Everything came back to these one or two obsessions. Once he left paid work, it seems almost everything in his life was either a conduit for one of his kinks, or it was something that was being negatively affected by them. Not a good situation. These films he made, and he made a lot more and more varied films than just the 2 versions of Enough Rope. There's really very little out there about them. They're a bit of an enigma, and here the story kind of touches on the area of lost media. The name of Jones's company, Kit Arden Motion Picture Productions, turns up nothing on Google or IMDb, of course, and nothing in any newspaper archive I've got access to, other than where it's mentioned in relation to his trial for murdering Marion Terry. It's not clear whether his prior work had actually been distributed in any way, however independently or informally, or if it was limited to just these one-off premieres at his home, and he otherwise kept them for his own enjoyment. The Mammoth Book of Bizarre Crimes, probably not the most meticulous and academic source, but one of the few publications to cover this obscure case, does make note that Jones's previous films were, quote, viewed at private screenings and distributed through a video network. None of the news articles I can find make reference to this. And what does that even mean, video network? It may just be the writer of that book speculating, dropping in the subtle hint of an ominous sounding organisation ready to pay big money for a murder on film, something to fuel the sensational fear about snuff. But there was one social movement that emerged in the early days of videotape that could account for that reference, and that's the phenomenon of videotape trading. This was where, before torrent sites, before YouTube, ad hoc networks of video enthusiasts would collect, share and swap tapes of TV shows, pirated movies, bootleg concert footage, cult or underground film, homemade horror movies, mixtapes of weird and rare footage, and almost everything else imaginable via the postal system. These groups were pretty huge in the 80s, and it would come as no surprise that a videographer and cinema buff like Geoffrey Jones would be in on that. If he did share his films this way, while there's nothing online, there may very well be tape collectors out there who have Geoffrey Jones directed short films in their collection. The idea of a tape trading network does also open an avenue of possibility, albeit a very slim one, for Jones to have encountered like-minded individuals, perhaps even someone willing to pay for or commission footage of a murder. As little as we know about the films themselves, we do know a wee bit about some of the actresses who appeared in his films. Tina Atter, who I mentioned at the start of the episode, was featured in that earlier production of Enough Rope. Appearing as a witness at Jones's trial in Birmingham Crown Court on the 22nd of April 1986, she recounted her experience of filming her version of the hanging scene. She described being asked to wear a black satin dress, standing on the same stool as Marion, beneath the same attic hatch, with a rope around her neck. Initially, Atter had refused to wear the noose, quote, "I didn't like the idea, it was a bit scary," but eventually she'd agreed to do so. Jones filmed close-ups of Tina's head dangling to one side with her eyes closed and her mouth hanging open, feigning death. This he edited together with separately filmed shots of her feet dangling to complete the illusion of a fatal hanging. Although she felt uncomfortable at times, Tina did not come to any physical harm during the production of the film. Quote, Mr. Brian Escott Cox, QC prosecuting, asked her, "Did you realise it was a real sliding noose, and if you fell your life would be in very real danger?" Mrs. Atter replied, "I didn't think of that at the time." Tina Atter also modelled for sets of still photos and appeared in at least one other film for Jones, a production entitled Safety Last. Given his interest in vintage cinema, I think that title probably is a reference to the old Harold Lloyd picture. Jones's version, though, wasn't a whimsical comedy. It involved scenes of various satin-clad actresses jumping out of the way of speeding buses and trains at the last second. Again, the film is not accessible anywhere, and it's unclear whether it was ever distributed beyond a private showing or two, so it's unknown whether these effects were achieved purely by creative editing, or whether he was actually shooting live vehicle stunts with these completely untrained women. As Brian Escott Cox noted, Jones's sexual thrills came from seeing young girls wearing black dresses in positions of danger. and it does seem like his willingness to put women in positions of danger was limited only by their willingness to cooperate with his direction. So, it wouldn't surprise me if he was asking them to jump out the way of like actual buses and stuff. According to the Birmingham Evening Mail, another would-be actress named Dawn Chambers had, about a year before Marion's death, been offered £1,000 from Jones, about $3,000 in today's money, to appear as the victim in enough rope. Chambers attended Jones's home to take part in rehearsals ahead of a planned shoot, and these rehearsals involved, you guessed it, wearing the noose round her neck and standing on the piano stool. Dawn, however, brought her boyfriend to the set, and Jones attempted nothing untoward. Nevertheless, seemingly on nothing more than a bad gut feeling, after this rehearsal, she decided not to proceed with the role, forfeiting the generous fee. Of Marion Terry, she later said, "When I heard what had happened to her, it sent a chill up my spine." Given that Dawn's rehearsal was so close to the version of Enough Rope that Jones shot with Tina Atter and later with horrific results with Marion Terry, I do wonder whether these were 2 or 3 distinct versions of the film, or whether he was almost constantly just having women over to act out this one situation and saying it was for a movie. And, how conscious were any of these women that they were basically appearing in a kind of fetish film? I think at least some of them were not aware of that at all. The fact of Tina Atter having her family and friends round to watch the premiere at Jones's house makes me think she wasn't so keenly aware of that. It was in some ways a slightly more innocent time, pre-internet. The film seems to have had the vestige of a storyline. It seems to have contained no actual nudity. The sexual elements of the film were so specific to Jones's own strange tastes that, with Jones shaping the context around it to the viewers and to the actresses, I think it's possible, maybe even likely, that that element just went over the participants' heads. Specifically, inviting families and friends to screenings was a clever manipulation, if that is what it was, in that it sort of deflects any suspicions people might have otherwise had. Mums and dads being the first people usually who would probably go, "Oh, you're going to see this creepy old man with his cameras again." If you're a creepy old man with a camera, how do you tackle that? How do you stop rumours and a reputation arising from that, which might interfere with your future ability to cast for your films? He invited them over. He made them feel involved. He plied them with ice cream. He set their minds at ease. And perhaps he even showed, a special edited version of the film at these screenings with the hanging scene trimmed down to a few seconds from maybe several minutes. Either way, the presentation of all this was designed to mask the true nature of his interest. He couldn't pull the wool over everyone's eyes though. Janet Turner, the dressmaker I mentioned earlier, ran a shop in Acox Green which Geoffrey Jones frequented over about 6 years. He would show up with his own rolls of expensive imported black satin, usually with a young woman, one of his models or actresses, in tow, and he would have bespoke dresses sized and made for these girls, always using the same tight-fitting Chinese-style design. Now obviously he was a good and lucrative customer for Mrs. Turner's shop, but on one such occasion, Jones seemed to take a shine to one of her assistants and offered the girl a role in a film. Turner overheard this, and feeling uneasy about Jones, she pulled the employee aside and successfully convinced her not to agree. Quote, "He asked whether she would try on a dress he had ordered and suggested she should take part in a railway film he was making. I just thought it was odd and I told her to say no. Obviously we had no idea of his intentions." At trial, the defence hinged on the aforementioned claim by Jones that Marion had come off the stool while he was out of the room and she was set up for the simulated hanging scene, and that he had tried, unsuccessfully, to save her. Excerpts of a transcript of an interview conducted by DCI Mackay 2 days after the murder were read out in the courtroom, in which Jones claimed he did everything in his power to help Marion. He described trying to support her weight and loosen the slip knot, but being prevented by her flailing limbs, bombarded, quote, as though she had 4 sets of hands, and that she bit his fingers as he tried to lift her head. But even here, in the very police interview where he's trying to save himself from life in jail essentially, his obsessions, his paraphilias, creep in to contaminate his thinking and even the lies he tells the police. Because he adds to this account of him supposedly fighting to save the girl's life and her thrashing around so much he's prevented from doing so. He says, "She was trying to experience the thrill of it, in my view." I think in all of this, that is probably the most repulsive insight into Jones's mind that I have found in the press material surrounding this case. Even, let's imagine for a moment, for argument's sake, let's pretend her death was an unintended outcome. Let's imagine she wasn't murdered deliberately, but died, as Geoffrey claimed, as a result of a stunt he had orchestrated, a situation he was responsible for putting her into, albeit not intending for her to die, but which is nonetheless a recklessly dangerous situation and one for which he is, at best, grossly negligent. Even then, for him to try and deflect some of the blame in that way, to try and lay some of the responsibility for what happened at the door of a dead 17-year-old girl by saying that she had, perhaps intentionally, stepped off the chair for a thrill, that her flailing at the end of the noose, which interfered with him helping her, supposedly, was not a woman thrashing in pain and terror, but someone fighting him off because she found it exciting. Even if the overall situation played out as he described it, which I do not for a second believe, that he went downstairs and came upstairs to find her dangling at the end of the rope. Only a mind completely addled by paraphilia, completely divorced from normal civilized humanity, could arrive at that rationale, I think. And when you consider that he's almost certainly lying, that he's had 2 days lying in hospital to concoct a story to try and save himself, and this is his best attempt, that's even worse. It's projection on a grand scale. Either his sensibilities are so dangerously deranged on the subject of asphyxiating women that he thinks, even on extended reflection, that this is a normal, credible story, or he's so consumed with this paraphilia that though he knows it's an obvious, audacious, offensive lie, he just can't help himself. He just can't stop himself sexualizing the appalling thing that's happened, even right there in front of the police as they're interviewing him. Apparently, Tina Atter actually met with Jones following his arrest, and he seemed happy to tell her that he'd shown Marion the hanging scene he'd shot with Tina before he hanged Marion. Absolutely bizarre and twisted. Among other things presented at trial were a screening of that original version of Enough Rope with Tina Atter, a poem Jones had written entitled 10 Little Beauty Queens, which was read out for the court by QC Brian Escott Cox and described a series of young girls being killed in gruesome ways, including being crushed by a steamroller, being sawn in half, being dismembered and flushed down the toilet, with the 10th and last victim being hanged. And more damningly than these, an extended confession of sorts, furiously scribbled by Jones after his arrest, which ended with the statement, "I murdered the girl, the innocent girl, I murdered her in hatred." On the 24th of April 1986, the jury in Jones's case deliberated on the charge of murder for just under an hour before returning the verdict of guilty. The judge, Sir Joseph Cantley, sentenced Geoffrey Jones to life imprisonment. The verdict is satisfying, I suppose, but it still leaves us with several questions. What of the rumours of snuff films and illicit networks? While the press and police made lots of allusion to the possibility of that at the trial itself, the broader ramifications of this part of the case, the potential involvement of buyers and so forth, weren't really explored. Which is to be expected, I suppose, given how dependent on hearsay and speculation that avenue seems to be. You can't go contaminating the jury's objectivity with rumours without really firm basis. But still, there's that slim yet nagging possibility. This case may have presented a missed opportunity, a possible embarkation point for a much larger investigation. Then you have, as you do in any murder case as gruesome as this, the question of whether the perpetrator could be responsible for other unsolved crimes. So these thoughts were all niggling away at me to varying degrees as I began to wind up the research for this, but then, right at the end, I came across a clipping on Newsbank from the Times of London dated 25th of April 1986, the day after Geoffrey Jones's conviction, headlined "Model's Hangman Gets Life." The main substance of this article is the testimony of a preacher whom Jones knew socially, and I feel it gives much more clarity to the path he was on that kind of led to Marion's death, and it fleshes out the general shape of his character, which by extension kind of goes some way towards answering those unanswered questions. The pastor, who isn't named in the article, but it's mentioned he leads a small congregation in Solihull, a large market town on the fringes of Birmingham, originally met Geoffrey Jones while the two men were employed together at Lucas Cooks and Cylon Limited. This would have been in the late 70s, so going back to about 8 or 10 years before the murder. He said Jones was initially very insular. He would see him sitting alone on lunch breaks, always eating the same thing, dry French bread with Marmite and a thermos of tea. Obviously, it's the Marmite that proves he's a psychopath. The pastor thought Jones seemed lonely, and so he made an extra effort to befriend him. Jones soon started opening up to his new friend about his interest in filmmaking and membership in the Solihull Amateur Film Society, about some of the films he'd made, including one in which a girl was chased through a railway yard, which all seemed interesting and relatively harmless. Less so were his statements about hating certain ethnic minorities, about his hatred of Jews, about his interest in deadly weapons and fascist literature. However, with time, more socialisation and seemingly some gentle encouragement from the pastor, by the start of the 1980s, Jones seems to be making progress as a human being, coming out of his shell, shedding some of the darker, more hateful parts of his persona. He started showing more sensitivity to minorities, renouncing his past comments about Jews, started making efforts to integrate with colleagues, and swapped his copy of Mein Kampf for the Bible. And then, mid-1981, shortly after his mother died, Geoffrey Jones requested voluntary severance from his employer, left work, and the pastor didn't see him again until the end of the year. Around Christmas time, Jones sought out the pastor and the two began meeting on a regular basis at the pastor's home, nominally as a sort of Bible study, I guess, but with the topic soon expanding to cover life, relationships, and some of Geoffrey's very personal problems. One night in the summer of 1983, the pastor was surprised when Jones suddenly opened up to him that he was unable to have sex with his girlfriend because he was only capable of being aroused by women in black satin dresses, and that he had no interest whatsoever in naked women. Jones then produced a series of photographs, a dozen or more, of different women he had hired to wear dresses and pose for him. The pastor listened and tried to offer supportive advice, but once Jones had made this admission, it was like he'd opened the floodgates. He would bring it up every time they met, steering the conversation back to his fetishes and his sexual problems. Jones went from visiting once every 3 weeks to 2 or 3 times a week, and the pastor began to suspect that he was actually getting off on talking about it. It wasn't long before Jones admitted to an incident that presaged the later killing of Marion Terry and maybe speaks a little bit to that question of escalation. You don't just go directly from zero to hanging someone in an elaborate murder plot overnight. Geoffrey Jones told of a relationship of sorts that he'd struck up with an ex-policewoman some years prior while he was working as an insurance salesman. At some point he'd gone to her house and at his request she'd put on one of his black satin dresses and agreed to pose for him on a stool with a noose around her neck while he snapped pictures. Jones had then looped the end of the rope over a banister and pulled. As he did so, well, let's say he found this an extremely gratifying act. When the pastor asked why Jones did this, why he enjoyed it so much, Jones blurted out that he hated women, and by putting the noose around her neck he felt he was able to release that pent-up hatred. The woman, of course, protested and pulled on her end of the rope to signal him to stop. And he did stop. But then Jones added, when he had looked at her standing there on the stool, he'd experienced the sudden urge to kick it out from under her and leave her there to die. This impulse, thankfully, he did not act upon. Instead, he helped her out of the noose and down off the stool. Jones asked the pastor a question. He said, and I'm paraphrasing because the article doesn't give the exact quote, he said, "Would you tell the police if I told you I was going to hang a woman and I couldn't stop myself?" The pastor told him, "Yes, I would, and I would tell them everything you've told me here today." To which Jones said, "What, me? I'm your friend." And then he seems to have kind of tried to play it off as a tongue-in-cheek, hypothetical thing. But the pastor told him, paraphrasing again, "You should speak to your therapist about this, and you need to take those photographs you took, and the ropes, and the dresses, and everything, and burn them." The next time he and Jones met, Geoffrey claimed to have done so, and seemed to have taken the rest of his advice to heart as well. For 7 weeks, he seemed like a new man. He continued to visit the pastor, but he was chatty, less depressed, like a man freed of his demons. Then, in early 1984, the talk of hangings and satin dresses began to worm their way back into their discussions. Geoffrey told his friend he was going to include a mock-up of a hanging scene in a film he was planning to shoot for the Solihull Amateur Film Society. The pastor recommended he didn't, under the circumstances, and Geoffrey agreed that that was probably the right choice. Instead, that project seems to have evolved into Safety Last, the one about young women being run over by trains and buses. But Jones would, of course, later, with the first versions of Enough Rope, return to the idea of simulating or inching closer to his dangerous strangulation fantasy by incorporating it into a seemingly otherwise normal short drama. Given the pastor's disapproval of the idea when it was first mooted, it seems Jones did not tell him about his later creations in that area. On the 8th of April 1985, Jones told the pastor he was suffering again with depression, and once more lamented his sexual issues with his fiancée. He mentioned he'd applied for a job on the London Underground, and that was the last time the two spoke. Just 10 days later, Marion Terry would be dead, and Jones would be lying on the floor, clutching a Bible. Based on this insight from everything he told his pastor friend, I think it's quite unlikely that Jones had killed before this. You know, I'm not a trained psychiatrist or criminal profiler or anything like that, but it really sounds to me like he's developed this very specific fantasy over time, probably fed by his relationship with his mother, his misogynistic view of women, his tendency towards hatred and anger and extremity, which is also hinted at by his interest in fascism, for example, and God knows what other experiences and influences. But this act is something he's been fixating on and circling closer and closer to, edging towards for several years by the time he does it. Think of that moment where he lost control with the ex-policewoman, with him paying women to act out a simulated version of the hanging. He was pushing the envelope further and further towards this outcome, living out parts of the fantasy but not the whole thing. The elaborate nature of the crime, in some ways, you know, it does seem like the crime of someone who has done it before. Often people who kill multiple times over a long period, their crimes become more extreme or more ritualized, more elaborate, more characteristic over time. That's part of the idea of escalation. So yeah, at a glance, the murder of Marion Terry looks a bit like the work of someone who has done this sort of thing before. But in the light of this pastor's testimony, I'd say that's because he has partially acted it out before many times, in fantasy within his own head, in a fictional context where he's having actresses act out the scene without actually harming them, in sexual encounters where he almost goes through with strangling his partner but stops short. In terms of the ritual of it all, the murder of Marion Terry was only one small action away from some of the fake hangings he'd filmed, the only additional action on his part being to kick away the stool. If he'd murdered before, why is this the time he decides to go to pieces afterwards? Taking 100 aspirins and crying down the phone to your fiancée about how you deserve to go to jail doesn't seem like the actions of a seasoned, cold-blooded killer. It much better fits the pattern of someone who took his perverted fantasy to the point of no return for the first time and is now experiencing a moment of horrifying clarity and remorse. That's not to lessen the severity of what he's done, however. In fact, to the contrary, My other takeaway from the pastor's testimony is that it greatly reduces the probability that there was anything accidental about Marion's death. We see just how fixated he was on the image of a girl being hanged, how he constantly seemed to toy with the idea, how close he had come to doing it to other women. Whether the killing was premeditated well in advance, or whether he just saw Marion on the stool and was simply overcome with the impulse to harm her, I have very little doubt that at some point in the whole process, he felt the desire to kill her and acted upon it, even if it was only for a few seconds. If the intent was there, it's not accidental, it's not manslaughter, it's murder. Finally, there's the snuff film question. Was Geoffrey Jones producing snuff films for commercial sale through a hidden criminal network? Quite frankly, other than the suggestion given by Brian Escott Cox and vague allusions in the tabloids, I can find almost zero evidence to solidly support that claim. To me, most of Jones's background and modus operandi kind of suggests like a sick individual trying to feed his own warped desires. A very personal, even solipsistic path where other people are just a means to an end, be they as victims, as objects of his desire, as sounding boards for his gruesome fantasies. While it's possible Jones had criminal connections or associated with other creeps who would be interested in footage of a murder, or might have egged him on, again, there doesn't really seem to be anything firm to suggest that. Not out of the question, but Occam's razor says he didn't need any outside motivation to do what he did. If there was anything on that angle, why wasn't it brought up at court? The Newcastle Journal, one of the publications that promulgated the potential snuff connection in this case, actually tips its hand a bit in credulously repeating the old hackneyed myth about, quote, a craze of snuff movies sweeping the US some years ago, where a subject would usually be lured to a lonely spot where he or she would be murdered before the camera. Again, if that was ever done during that time, even once, and it might have been, the product never found its way into the hands of the FBI, with all their resources and connections, so if such a film existed at all, they can still hardly have been called a craze that swept America, as the journal puts it. Again, fake snuff-like films existed, utilising horror movie-style effects, and films that showed real death in a documentary context, or that kind of thing, did exist, but it's likely the journalists and the police are conflating these with the snuff industry legend where people are killed for the film. And if they're falling into that old trap, then we have to treat their ideas on the rest of that particular topic with some caution. While it's not outside the realms of possibility, the idea that Marion's murder footage was sold on to a ready buyer is something I honestly wouldn't give more than a 1 in 100 chance of being true. Much more likely is the possibility that Jones tore off in his car to hide footage of Marion's death for his own benefit. We don't know whether he was actually filming at the point of the murder. The cameras may have been rolling, or the pretext to get her on the stool may have been another of his so-called rehearsals. Following Marion's death, he would, of course, have realised he was very likely going to jail, or at least to trial for what he'd done. If he did film himself kicking the stool from under her and then standing idly by while she asphyxiated, that's pretty inescapable evidence against any defence he has of it being an accident. To avoid it falling into the hands of investigators, he could have destroyed the film, but then this is a recording of the very act he's been building to, fantasising about all this time. Would he destroy it? Or would he take it and hide it somewhere, bury it under a tree or something? I think this could very well explain what he was up to when he was seen leaving the property following the murder. He could have hoped to retrieve the footage on his release. Not a snuff film in the commercial sense, but functionally almost the same thing as far as his own twisted thrills are concerned. A death film of his victim's last moments, something to help him relive the terrible act he'd been building to for so long. If that is the case, well, I'm happy to say he has never, as far as I can tell, been able to recover it. Jones was given a life sentence, and it seems he has never been released from prison. I can certainly find no record of that happening. If he's still alive, and I haven't even been able to confirm whether or not he is, he'll be in his mid-80s today, elderly, fading, having wasted his life and his freedom for the sake of a cruel, grotesque obsession. And thus ends the story and the life of Geoffrey Jones. In some ways, it might be seen as a good thing that this case has fallen into obscurity. I was kind of ambivalent about giving the case even what little attention this podcast will bring it, because Geoffrey Jones is a gross, pathetic individual who doesn't deserve fame or notoriety. No murderer does, but usually that horse has bolted by the time we get to it. The typical criminal we discuss is usually someone who has already embedded himself in the culture, in the psyche of the public. Jones not so much. His case, sensational as it was, slipped from memory as it slipped from the headlines. In a way, maybe it would be fitting to just leave him there to moulder in the compost heap of history. But I decided in the end to cover it here, firstly because the way it ties into the mythology of the snuff industry is right up Talking Till Dawn's alley in terms of our interest in urban legends and in hidden worlds that may or may not exist just out of sight. But there are two other reasons, probably much better reasons. First, as much as Jones deserves no place in our minds or our memories, Marion Terry does. She was a human being, a loving daughter, a friend, a girlfriend, a young person who had her life extinguished before she even figured out what she wanted to do with it. The terrible, barbaric injustice she suffered for one man's twisted pleasure, a life taken before it came to fruition, that deserves never to be forgotten. Secondly, because in many ways Jones doesn't seem like a born killer. He seems like someone who allowed his obsessions, his kinks, the darker impulses of his mind, slowly, piece by piece, to consume him, to define him, and to lead him to a place where it was inevitable, whether by premeditated scheme or by momentary loss of self-control, he was going to do something terrible. He had these fetishes, these impulses, and he fed them, he cultivated them, and he let them lead him to the point where he knew, as he said to his friend, he knew he was going to do something appalling. Very few people set out to do evil in life initially. That's not like a, oh, it's not their fault sort of statement. I think there are some people who actively try to be as monstrous as possible, but a lot of people who do really bad things either think they're doing the right thing, or, like Jones, I think, like the frog in the slowly warming pot, starting small and gradually letting themselves away with more and more, lacking the self-insight, the self-reflection to see how far they've wandered from normality and a healthy sort of outlook on the world. And eventually they get to a terrible, terrible place. That is not an excuse for these people. That is a warning to all of us. Now, I'm not saying most people are capable of something like what Geoffrey Jones did, but just as we all have the potential to be better people, we all have the potential to be much worse. And it's easier to slide slowly into being worse than it is to strive to be better. Just as we don't maybe choose our circumstances, we don't necessarily choose the ideas, the thoughts, the attractions, the fixations and addictions that might lodge in our brains. But you're still responsible for where that journey takes you. You do choose which branches of your interests to exercise and to cultivate and to allow to develop. That's in all areas of life, and everyone has a responsibility to themselves first and foremost, to take a look at themselves once in a while, to step back and say, are my interests, my peccadillos, my habits, my hobbies making me healthier and happier and more fulfilled as a person? Are they part of a rounded human being, or are they making me more unhappy? Are they making me more isolated? Are they taking me to a dark place? Are they starting to become me? Are they starting to impinge on other happier, healthier things like friendships and relationships? Are they pushing me further from fulfillment? Are they causing me harm? And at the extreme end, are they increasing the likelihood I may do harm to others? To look at the case of someone who maybe lacked the ability to apply that kind of critical thinking to his own direction in life, or at least lacked the ability or the drive to take action to change his direction in life, that can, I think, be a valuable lesson. Don't lose sight of yourself. Don't lose perspective on what you might be heading towards. And if you feel you have, in most cases, help us out there if you really want it. It might save your life. It might save someone else's life. I hope this hasn't been too depressing a case. Maybe it suffered a little bit from not having the two of us batting back and forth to lighten the tone, but I I hope you found it interesting nonetheless. Hopefully Mike will be back with me for the next episode. Maybe it'll be something a little lighter, but no promises, of course. Thanks again for listening, and to everyone who has supported the show either on Patreon or by sharing it or just generally spreading the word. There would be no Talking Till Dawn without you guys. We're very grateful to have each and every one of you as a supporter. Oh, I meant to ask, by the way, if any of our listeners in England have knowledge of this, perhaps via the prison system or otherwise, I'd be very interested to find out definitively whether Jones is alive or dead, whether he's still in jail. If he is, surely there are hundreds of people who've served time with him or worked in prison where he's held, yet there's just nothing anywhere about what became of him, if he's still inside, if he was released. If anyone does know, it would give me a wee bit of closure, just knowing for sure he never got out, first and foremost. Right, well, the sun is coming up, and I'm going to head off now. We'll be back soon with another episode. In the meantime, if you happen to find any suspicious cans of film under a railway bridge, maybe just leave them to rot. Take care, everybody. Good night.